Sandra Sandoval was a name whispered by the dusty wind of Sinaloa, a silent promise in a land that only screamed violence and resignation. Born with a mind that saw the world in patterns and numbers, she was the daughter of an accountant, a man whose righteousness was as rare and inflexible as a rock in the middle of the desert. Her path, until then, had been traced within the lines of a ledger, orderly, predictable, and safe. Since she was a child, she saw the cold logic of balance sheets and projections as a form of art, a refuge from the impulsive chaos that ruled life outside her family's modest home. She didn't dream of parties or weddings, but of the day her calculations could build something solid, something that the dust and blood of her homeland could not stain. Her intelligence was her blessing and her curse. While other girls her age learned the secrets of domestic chores, Sandra learned from her father the secrets of capital flow, the art of tracking every cent like a hunter stalking its prey. This story I'm about to tell is heavy, full of pain and terrible choices, and I know it will stir the conscience of many. If it resonates with your reality in any way, I ask you to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. It is your strength that allows me to continue giving voice to these memories. Please also comment what city or country you're listening from. I want to know how far these voices from the past can travel and find new ears. She grew up seeing corruption as a season of the year, an inevitable certainty that arrived to reap the hopes of good men. The local caciques, with their dirty boots and golden smiles, were the lords of everything, and the law was merely a tool in their calloused hands. The air in her small town was thick, heavy with unspoken fear and the silent humiliation of those who knew their lives were worth less than a shipment of contraband. Sandra observed all of this with a cold, analytical anger, recording every injustice, like a debt in an accounting book that she felt one day would need to be paid. The oppression was not an event, it was the very atmosphere everyone breathed. Her father, in his noble naivety, believed that honesty was a shield. He taught her that integrity was the only asset no one could steal. Sandra, on the other hand, saw this shield as something fragile, a thin pane of glass before an avalanche. She loved her father deeply, but a part of her, the part that saw the world in probabilities and logical outcomes, knew that in Sinaloa, honesty wasn't a shield, but a target. This internal conflict consumed her, creating a duality in her soul. The daughter who respected her father's principles, and the strategist who saw the inevitable collision of those principles with the brutality of the real world. The presence of El General Arturo Montoya was like a cancer slowly spreading throughout the region. He was a man of the old guard, a dinosaur of drug trafficking who believed in the absolute power of brute force. His men were the embodiment of fear, and his influence extended from police stations to political offices. To Sandra, Montoya's cartel was not just a criminal organization. It was the physical manifestation of the irrational chaos she so despised. She studied his movements from a distance, not out of fascination, but as one studies a disease, seeking to understand its structure to one day, perhaps, find its fundamental weakness and exploit every one of its flaws. The conflict was imminent, a storm cloud forming on the horizon of her quiet life. Sandra felt it in the way people lowered their eyes when the cartel's trucks passed, in the silence that fell over the market when one of El General's lieutenants appeared to collect his protection fee. The aversion she felt for their brutality was visceral, an almost allergic reaction to their crude display of power. She saw violence not only as immoral but as inefficient, a clumsy tool for minds that knew nothing of the subtlety of manipulation and strategy. She dreamed of fighting them, not with a weapon, but with a pencil and a ledger, dismantling their empire from the inside out. On a hot afternoon, while reviewing the books of a small local merchant with her father, she witnessed his integrity in action. The merchant, desperate, suggested omitting a portion of his earnings to pay less in taxes and thus have enough for the cartel's protection fee. Her father refused with a serene firmness. "Our word and our name are the only things we truly own, my son," he told the man. "If we lose that, we lose everything." In that moment, Sandra felt immense pride, but also a chill of dread. She understood that her father was not a coward. He was a soldier in a war that was already lost, fighting with weapons the enemy neither recognized nor respected. The last night of her old life was one of torturous normalcy. The family dinner, the smell of cooking beans, her mother's calm voice, her father's solid presence. There was an underlying tension, a fear that hung in the air like the buzz of an insect in the dark, but they ignored it, clinging to routine like a castaway clings to a piece of wood. It was the calm before the storm, the last breath of a world that was about to be annihilated. Sandra, with her analytical mind, couldn't help but calculate the probabilities, and they all pointed to a grim outcome. She just never imagined the brutality with which that probability would become an absolute and merciless certainty. The tranquility was shattered without warning. The front door wasn't broken down. It was simply opened, as if the house itself dared not offer resistance. 3 dark figures filled the doorway, their silhouettes cut against the dusty late afternoon light. They weren't the local caciques, with their familiar brutality. They were El General's sicarios, men whose faces were masks of indifference, their eyes empty from having seen and committed the unthinkable. The silence they brought was more terrifying than any scream. Every movement was deliberate, professional, turning Sandra's family home into occupied territory. Hidden in her room, watching through a crack in the door, she felt the air turn to ice, the logic of numbers dissolving before the irrationality of pure force and the imminence of violence. The group's leader, a man with a scar that pulled his lip into a perpetual sneer, approached her father. The proposal wasn't made in whispers or veiled threats, but with the clarity of a business transaction. "El General admires your talent with numbers, Don Sandoval," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "He has a new business, large and prosperous. He needs a discreet accountant to keep everything clean. Your name was recommended." It was not an invitation. It was a summons. The demand to launder the cartel's blood-soaked money was placed on the dining room table, staining the polished wood with its mere mention. Sandra saw her father age a decade in that instant, the weight of the world falling upon his honored and weary shoulders. Her father's response was an act of courage that sealed his fate. He stood up, not defiantly, but with the quiet dignity that had always defined him. His eyes met Sandra's for a brief second, a silent apology for the world being as it was, and a testament to his love. Then he turned to the sicario and spoke the only word his conscience would allow. No. The word hung in the air, small yet unshakable. There was no hesitation in his voice, only the certainty of a man who would rather face death than betray his principles. To the assassins, this was not heroism. It was a mere obstacle to be removed. The refusal was met not with anger, but with a cold, dispassionate efficiency, like someone simply moving to the next item on a to-do list. The sound of the gunshots was dry, brutally loud in the confined space of the small living room. Sandra pressed her hands over her mouth to stifle her own scream, the metallic taste of panic flooding her throat. From her hiding spot, she saw her hero, the man who taught her the value of integrity, fall like a puppet whose strings had been cut. There was no drama, no final words, just the terrible finality of violence. The smell of gunpowder and blood permeated the air, a scent that would become the central memory of her existence. The men left as calmly as they had entered, leaving behind a body, a shattered life, and a silent witness who in that exact moment felt the young, dreamy Sandra Sandoval die along with her father, giving way to something cold, broken, and dangerous. The next day, driven by a final shred of hope in order and justice, Sandra went to the police station. The office of Commander Morales reeked of stale coffee and cynicism. She recounted the events, her voice trembling but precise, every detail of the horror etched into her mind. Morales listened with a poorly disguised boredom, drumming his fingers on the desk. His response was a slap in the face, more cruel than any physical blow. "Young lady," he said with a condescending sigh, "your father was a good man, but a stubborn one. He chose the wrong side in a business dispute. It happens. I suggest you go home and forget about it, for your own safety." It was there, in that filthy office, that Sandra understood the truth. Justice wasn't blind. It was bought, and it was on the side of the monsters. The law did not exist to protect her. It existed to protect men like El General. Sandra's grief was not made of tears, but of an icy silence and a purpose that crystallized in her chest. She disappeared. To the small community of Sinaloa, the accountant's daughter had simply vanished into dust, consumed by sorrow or fear. But she wasn't hiding. She was forging herself. In an anonymous border town, she lived in cheap rooms, devouring books on economics, logistics, cryptography, and military strategy. Her father's face was a constant ghost, not a reminder of her pain, but a catalyst for her fury. Every equation she solved, every system she dissected, was a step away from the powerless girl who had watched a murder through a crack in a door. She was building a weapon, and that weapon was her own mind. It was in this abyss of loneliness and planning that she renounced her birth name. Sandoval was the name of an honorable man who died for his honor. It was a victim's name. She needed a name that represented power, fluidity, and coldness. She rechristened herself as Plata, Sandra Plata. The name sounded like metal, like wealth, like the bullets that took her father's life. It was there, at rock bottom, that I understood there would be no justice from others. I would have to be my own justice, my own law, and if you have ever felt completely powerless, you know exactly what I'm talking about. To continue telling this is difficult, but your support, every subscription to the channel, gives me the strength not to let stories like mine be forgotten in time. Her first ally was not found among criminals, but in the figure of El Chivo, a former cartel gunslinger who had quietly retired. He had known her father, respected him, and saw in Sandra the same spark of integrity, now twisted into something far more dangerous. El Chivo was tired of the senseless brutality of the new generation of narcos, the lack of codes and honor. He didn't see a revenger in Sandra, but a force of order, someone who could use logic to fight the chaos. He taught her how to read men, to understand the language of violence, and most importantly, how to survive in a world where one wrong word meant death. He became her shadow, her protector, the moral compass she would soon begin to ignore. Sandra's first move was a masterpiece of subversion. She didn't use a single bullet. With a fake identity and a laptop, she hacked into the accounting system of one of El General's front suppliers. With a few lines of code, she created a series of phantom transactions, small discrepancies that, when added up, made it seem like one of Montoya's most trusted lieutenants was stealing from him. The amount was insignificant, but the seed of distrust was planted. El General, a man whose mind only understood direct, bloody betrayals, couldn't trace the digital origin of the problem. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He brutally punished his lieutenant, weakening his own organization and showing everyone that his command was vulnerable. Sandra watched it all from a distance, feeling nothing but a cold, calculated satisfaction. With the success of her first foray, Sandra felt she needed more sophisticated tools. She located Sophia, a young, idealistic hacker who operated on dark web forums, exposing corporate corruption. Sandra approached her not as a criminal, but as a vigilante, a mysterious figure determined to bring down an empire that exploited the weak. Sophia, fascinated by Sandra's intelligence and the apparent nobility of her cause, accepted the offer. She saw Sandra Plata as a feminist icon, a woman breaking the rules in a world of violent men. She had no idea she was becoming a fundamental piece in a machine of vengeance that would consume everything around it, including her own innocence and ideals. The next step was to strike at the cartel's financial heart. Sandra, using the pseudonym of a European investment consultant, arranged a dinner with a corrupt banker in Mexico City, the man responsible for laundering most of El General's fortune. The scene was a ballet of manipulation. In a luxurious restaurant surrounded by power and opulence, Sandra didn't talk about crime. She talked about instability, about the uncertain future of the cartel under Montoya's impulsive command. Calmly, and with a flood of financial data that Sofia had collected, she demonstrated how El General's empire was doomed to collapse and offered the banker a safe way out. Discreetly divert a percentage of the funds to accounts she controlled. Terrified and seduced by her logic, the man gave in. It was then that Commander Morales re-entered her life. With El General's cartel showing signs of internal instability, Morales saw an opportunity. Sandra contacted him anonymously, offering precise information on the operations of Montoya's rivals, data that would allow Morales to carry out spectacular seizures and build his career as a crime-fighting hero. In return, she only asked that he turn a blind eye to certain logistical movements she was beginning to establish. Morales, an ambitious and unscrupulous man, accepted the game. He knew he was dancing with the devil, but the benefits were too great to refuse. Thus began the most dangerous and unstable alliance of Sandra's journey. With the cartel's finances being bled from within and its enemies being strengthened by Morales's tips, Sandra began to build her own empire in the shadows. She didn't traffic drugs, but she controlled what was most important: logistics and money. She acquired small transport companies, warehouses in strategic locations, and encrypted communication systems. She became the invisible gear that made the underworld function. Other cartels, smaller and more modern, began to use her services, paying a high price for efficiency and anonymity. Sandra Plata was becoming a whispered legend, a ghost who could move millions of dollars and tons of goods without ever showing her a face. The power she was accumulating was abstract but absolute, but power exacts its price in blood. A former neighbor from her hometown, a man who had been a friend of her father, recognized her during one of her rare supervisory trips. Driven by greed, he tried to sell her out to men loyal to El General. El Chivo intercepted the communication and captured the traitor. He brought him to Sandra, expecting her to exile him, to show a shred of the mercy her father would have had. But Sandra, looking into the eyes of the man who had once eaten at her table, saw nothing but a risk, a loose variable in her equation. With a voice that did not waver, she gave the order to El Chivo. The execution was swift. In that moment, I crossed a line from which there was no return. The old Sandra died forever. Sometimes I wonder if anyone understands the weight of that choice. If you understand and you want me to continue exposing the truth behind power, subscribe. Every new subscriber is proof that I'm not alone in this darkness. News of the execution spread like wildfire through the underworld, not as an act of betrayal, but as a declaration of power. Sandra Plata did not forgive. Fear, she discovered, was a more effective management tool than loyalty. People didn't need to love her, they needed to fear her. Her reputation grew, and with it, her empire. She moved to a penthouse in Mexico City, an eagle's nest of glass and steel from which she could observe the city like a chessboard. Her days were a succession of screens, numbers, and decisions that moved the fates of hundreds of people. She had become the queen of an invisible kingdom, but the crown was heavy and forged in solitude. Meanwhile, El General was going mad. His world, once governed by simple rules of violence and loyalty, was crumbling for reasons he couldn't comprehend. Money vanished, his trusted men betrayed him or died, and his enemies seemed to know his every move. His brutal, direct mind couldn't conceive of an enemy who didn't use guns, and his ingrained machismo prevented him from even considering that a woman could be the architect of his ruin. He was hunting a ghost, a rival he imagined to be as brutal as himself, never realizing that his nemesis was a force he despised, female intelligence sharp and relentless. The situation attracted unwanted attention from across the border. Agent Peterson of the DEA, a stubborn man with a black-and-white view of the world, was sent to Mexico to understand why the flow of drugs had become so chaotic and unpredictable. Peterson didn't understand the nuances of Mexican corruption. He only saw the problem and believed in a solution based on pressure and force. He began to lean on the Mexican authorities, and his main target became Commander Morales, whose success statistics seemed too good to be true. Peterson's arrival added a new layer of complexity to the game, an incorruptible player whose actions were dangerously predictable. For Sandra, the fear she inspired was a double-edged sword. She had become a predator, but that meant she saw prey everywhere. Paranoia began to creep into her mind. Every unanswered call, every lingering glance, every silence was interpreted as a sign of betrayal. She reinforced her security, changed her communication patterns, and isolated herself even further, trusting only El Chivo, whose silent loyalty was her only safe harbor. Yet even he felt the growing distance between them. He protected Sandra Plata, the boss, but he missed Sandra Sandoval, the girl he had sworn to help find justice, not become a tyrant herself. The change in Sandra was most evident in her relationship with Sophia. The young hacker, who once idolized her boss, now operated in constant fear. She saw the coldness with which Sandra made life-or-death decisions and realized that the noble cause was just a facade for a personal destructive vendetta. Sophia became careless, making small mistakes in her code, her subconscious seeking a way out of the gilded cage. Sandra, with her analytical mind, noticed the flaws. Sophia was no longer an asset. She was becoming a liability, a weak link in a chain that needed to be unbreakable for her to survive what was coming. Sandra's empire was a marvel of efficiency, but it was cold and soulless. The luxurious mansions where she sometimes stayed were empty. The armored cars were mobile prisons. The power she had sought to ensure she would never again be a victim had turned her into a prisoner. She was a queen in a castle of mirrors, seeing only reflections of herself and her own suspicions. The ghost of her father visited her in dreams, no longer as a figure of pride, but with a look of sadness and disappointment. She had defeated the monsters, but in doing so, she had become the most fearsome of them all. Sandra's moral decay was accompanied by a change in her appearance. The earthy tones of her youth in Sinaloa gave way to a wardrobe of cold, metallic colors: black, gray, dark blue. Her clothes were like armor, her gestures precise and controlled. The only warmth in her life came from the expensive whiskey she drank late at night, as she watched the city lights, trying in vain to silence the voices in her head. The girl who loved the order of numbers now presided over an empire of chaos, and the irony of it was not lost on her, eating away at her from the inside like a slow, relentless acid. El Chivo tried to intervene. In a rare display of emotion, he confronted her. "The revenge has been served, Sandra," he said, using her old name on purpose. "Montoya is ruined. What more do you want?" Her reply was glacial. "He's still breathing, Chivo. As long as he breathes, the debt isn't paid. I don't just want to ruin him, I want to erase him from existence." In that moment, El Chivo understood that she was no longer on a mission for justice. She was in a spiral of hatred, a journey of self-destruction that would drag everyone around her into the abyss with her. His loyalty remained, but it was now tinged with a profound sadness. El General's luck finally turned. After months of dead ends, the brutal torture of dozens of people finally gave him a name: Sophia. One of his informants discovered the identity of the young hacker who, in a moment of carelessness, had used an old digital signature. Montoya didn't know the full connection, but he knew this girl was the key to the ghost that haunted him. He didn't seek her out for interrogation. He saw her as bait. He began to watch her, waiting for her to lead him to the bigger fish. The hunt, once abstract and frustrating, now had a face, a concrete target. The wounded predator was about to take his last, most dangerous bite. At the same time, Agent Peterson's pressure on Commander Morales reached a boiling point. The DEA threatened to expose Morales's corruption if he didn't deliver a high-value target. Desperate to save his career and his life, Morales reviewed his options. He knew of the existence of Sandra Plata, his ghost informant. Handing her over would be the masterstroke of his life, transforming him from a corrupt official into a national hero who brought down the mysterious financier of the underworld. Betrayal was no longer a possibility, it was his only survival plan. He began using government resources to hunt his own ally, preparing the ground for the final strike. The walls were closing in on Sandra. She felt the change in the atmosphere, the growing tension in communications. Her network of informants began sending her fragmented, alarming reports. Montoya's men were moving strangely, and Morales's units were conducting surveillance in areas near her operations. Her paranoia, which once seemed a weakness, was now her greatest asset. She saw the connections no one else did, the shadows aligning to form the design of a trap. She knew a confrontation was inevitable. The war she had waged in the shadows was about to explode into open, devastating violence. Sandra's loneliness reached its peak. In her penthouse, surrounded by state-of-the-art technology, she had never been more isolated. She watched surveillance footage of Sophia, noting the discreet cars that followed her. She intercepted Morales's communications, hearing the web of betrayal closing around her. She was the most powerful and well-informed woman in Mexico, and also the most hunted. There was no one she could fully trust, not even El Chivo, whose disapproval was a silent judgment in every gesture. She was an island, about to be swallowed by the tide of violence she herself had created. El General's plan was simple and brutal: kidnap Sophia and use her to lure Sandra into an ambush at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He wanted to confront his enemy face to face, so that the last thing the ghost saw would be his face. He didn't just want to kill her, he wanted to humiliate her, to prove that, in the end, brute force would always overcome cunning. He gathered his most loyal men, preparing for what he believed would be the final battle to restore his honor and his power in the cartel. Morales, for his part, planned his own operation. Using data from the DEA, he located one of Sandra's main distribution centers, a massive facility that served as the heart of her logistical empire. His plan was to raid the site during a major transaction, catching Sandra in the act with irrefutable evidence. He would become a legend, the man who decapitated the financial hydra of organized crime. He mobilized special forces, preparing for an operation that would be broadcast on every news channel in the country. But Sandra was always one step ahead. Analyzing the movements of her two enemies, she saw not two separate traps, but a single opportunity. She knew Montoya would use Sophia as bait and that Morales would attack her distribution center. In a stroke of strategic genius, born of desperation, she decided not to avoid the traps, but to control them. She leaked information to Montoya, confirming she would be at the distribution center to meet Sophia. And she made sure that Morales knew that Montoya and his men would be there too. The final piece was in place. Sandra would not go to the confrontation as a victim, but as the director of a bloody spectacle. She would turn her distribution center into a slaughterhouse. She would lure her two greatest enemies to the same place, at the same time and make them destroy each other. It would be her final act, the greatest and most chaotic demonstration of her power. She was no longer just seeking revenge for her father. She was seeking the total annihilation of a system that had created her and now wanted to destroy her. The cornered queen was about to flip the entire board. The distribution center was a city of metal and shadows under the cloak of night. Shipping containers stacked like skyscrapers created an industrial labyrinth, a perfect stage for the final act. In the heart of this labyrinth, hidden in a reinforced control room overlooking the main yards, Sandra Plata watched dozens of monitors. She was not a combatant on the battlefield. She was the omniscient mind, the conductor of an orchestra of destruction. At her side, silent and tense, stood El Chivo, her last piece of loyalty on a board where everyone else was a pawn or an enemy. The air in the room was thin, charged with the electricity that precedes a storm. Every second of silence was a grain of sand falling through an hourglass, measuring the time left in their lives. The first to arrive was El General, driven by the arrogance of a predator who believes he has cornered his prey. His men, a small army of battle-hardened sicarios, spread out across the yard, dragging a gagged and terrified Sophia as a sacrificial trophy. They took their positions, weapons ready, expecting the mysterious Sandra Plata to emerge from the shadows to save the girl. Montoya's confidence was his greatest miscalculation. He expected a woman he could break with his own hands. He didn't understand that his enemy was not made of flesh and bone, but of strategy and information. He was walking into a killing field that had been meticulously prepared for him, and he did so with a sneer on his face. Minutes later, the distant lights of police vehicles signaled the arrival of the second player. Commander Morales and his elite federal squad surrounded the perimeter, moving with the precision of a force that believes it has the element of surprise. Morales's plan was flawless on paper: capture 2 cartel leaders at once, making himself the undisputed hero of the drug war. He didn't know he was just another puppet in Sandra's play. As he gave the order for his men to advance, he wasn't initiating a police operation. He was pulling the second pin on a grenade, setting his soldiers on a direct collision course with the assassins of one of Mexico's most violent cartels. The stage was set for a slaughter. From her control room, Sandra began the performance. With a single command, all the lights in the yard went out, plunging the area into near total darkness. The chaos was instant. Then a single spotlight switched on, brutally illuminating a group of Montoya's men directly in front of an advancing federal unit. Before anyone could understand what was happening, Sandra hijacked the radio frequencies of both sides with pre-recorded messages, mimicking their men's voices, screaming about betrayal and ambushes. Container gates slammed shut with a deafening crash, separating squads, creating dead ends, and forcing direct confrontations. She didn't need an army. She had the environment itself as her deadliest weapon. The battle erupted in an uncontrolled fury. Federals and sicarios, blinded by darkness and deafened by misinformation, opened fire on each other in a frenzy of violence. El General, realizing too late the complexity of the trap, bellowed orders that were lost in the gunfire, his rage making him a reckless and easy target. Morales, from his command post miles away, watched in horror on his monitors as his glorious operation turned into a televised massacre, a political disaster from which he would never recover. On Sandra's monitors, the flashing lights of combat reflected in her cold eyes. She watched the chaos she had sown with the detachment of a vengeful goddess, feeling the absolute power that came from controlling the fate of her enemies. At the height of the pandemonium, a small group of sicarios, separated from the main fight, stumbled upon the location of the control room. The armored door shuddered under the force of their blows. The final confrontation became intimate and brutal. As Sandra initiated the final sequence of her plan, El Chivo stood before the door. He didn't say goodbye. He simply looked at her one last time, a look that mixed loyalty, sadness, and a paternal pride. When the door finally gave way, he faced them with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. The sounds of the fight were short and violent. The silence that followed was the final price Sandra paid, the sacrifice of her last human connection to secure her victory. Escaping through an emergency passage as the sound of sirens grew louder, Sandra came face to face with a wounded and enraged El General, cornered and the last survivor of his personal guard. He raised his gun, his face contorted in hatred, but she was on her territory. With a touch of a remote control, the sector's fire suppression system activated. A thick cloud of halon gas hissed from the sprinklers, displacing the oxygen from the air. As Montoya choked, suffocating uselessly, Sandra watched him from the shadows, her face impassive. His brute force was defeated not by a bullet, but by intelligence. She had won. But as she looked at her enemy's body and heard the echo of El Chivo's sacrifice in her soul, victory had the bitter taste of ashes. The sirens wailed, tearing through the night, a cacophony that announced the end of an empire. As Morales' forces, now disoriented and leaderless, tried to make sense of the bloodbath, Sandra, wounded and bleeding, slipped away through the service passages she herself had designed. Every step away from the distribution center was a step away from the power she had accumulated. News of her organization's collapse would spread like wildfire. Without her leadership, without the central mind, to connect all the pieces, her logistical empire, once a model of efficiency, would fragment in a matter of hours. Exposed, hunted, and without her main protector, she was once again a fugitive, the architect of a kingdom in ruins, disappearing into the city's darkness. Taking refuge in an anonymous apartment on the outskirts, the adrenaline that had sustained her finally dissipated, leaving behind a sharp pain and an abyssal emptiness. Victory brought no peace, only silence. The face of El Chivo, in his final act of loyalty, haunted her thoughts more intensely than the memory of her fallen enemies. She had won the game, eliminated all threats, paid her father's blood debt, but the cost had been her own soul. Looking at her reflection in a dark window, she didn't see the powerful Sandra Plata, but the wreckage of Sandra Sandoval, a woman who had become a monster to hunt others, only to find that the wasteland left after the war was her only reward. Time passed, turning news into history and history into legend. Far from Mexico, in a European city of quiet streets and grey skies, a woman with short hair read a newspaper in a cafe. She was a nobody, just another face in the crowd, her identity forged with the same precision with which she had once dismantled a cartel. She possessed a fortune that guaranteed her comfort for the rest of her life, but she lived in a self-imposed exile, an existence without purpose. The power that once defined her was gone, replaced by a freedom that felt terrifyingly like a prison. She was a ghost haunted by her own legend, a queen without a kingdom, eternally fleeing a war she had already won. One day, the screen of a television in the corner of the cafe showed a report on the endless drug war in Mexico. The reporter spoke of the power vacuum left after the collapse of El General's empire, briefly mentioning the enigmatic, almost mythical figure known as Plata, who had caused unprecedented chaos and then disappeared. The report showed that new factions, even more violent and cruel, had risen to fill that vacuum. In that instant, Sandra understood the futility of her journey. She hadn't cleansed the system, she had merely rebooted it. She hadn't been a force for change, just another catalyst for violence in a never-ending cycle of power and blood. Her face, reflected in the cafe window, showed no emotion. Her revenge was complete, but the result was only more chaos, more pain. She had survived, but at what cost? The woman who once dreamed of building something solid with the logic of numbers had left behind only destruction. And there, anonymous and forgotten, I understood the true cost. I thank each of you who listened to my story to the end. The journey was dark, and your support, subscribing to this channel, is the only light that shows me that sharing these painful truths still matters, so that perhaps others do not have to walk the same devastating path. Power does not liberate, it consumes. And in the end, there was nothing left but the void.